I was scrolling through my Facebook feed the other day when I saw a post from a friend of mine that asked a simple question. It said, "What are the issues you wish the church was not silent on?" And to my surprise, the thread had close to 200 responses, mostly from younger people. So I read through the entire thread and identified the 5 most popular responses given. And in this video, I'll share it with you what those 5 issues are. 5 issues the church must stop ignoring.
Well, hey there, and welcome to Pro Church Tools, the show where in 10 minutes or less, you're going to get a dose of tips and tactics to help your church share the message of Jesus while we navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm your host, Alex Mills, joined as always by the boss man, Brady Shearer.
A friend of mine who we've done a podcast with before, session number 189 of the Pro Church podcast, when we did interview style podcast, Justin Koo. He's a friend of mine on Facebook, and he's also That Christian Vlogger on YouTube. Does a ton of great stuff for the church through online and through YouTube. Anyway, he asked this question on his Facebook page. It's just something like, hey, what are the issues that you wish the church was not silent on? And the thread blew up. He even said himself, he's like, I didn't expect this many responses.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important observation. There is a lot that the church has purposefully, very purposely decided, you know what, we're just not going to touch that because it's a little bit too...
Yeah.
And we wanted to talk through these 5 issues because we think, hey, it's about time the church begins to address these. A lot of these responses were from younger people that have been excommunicated by the church, people that have left the church because they feel like, hey, we're not being real. We're not tackling the issues that are most important, that the Bible actually speaks to because it's more convenient and comfortable to ignore them. And this is what communications is all about.
Yeah.
You might be thinking, what does that have to do with digital media? We talk about communications at our company, Pro Church Tools. Every interaction with another human that your church makes, either in person, online, or just indirectly, is communications. And this is a brand problem that our churches have globally, nationally, continentally. And the 5 biggest issues that we found in this thread are as follows.
Well, before we get into it,
No. Okay, sorry, you can talk.
I just wanted to say, like, kind of as a disclaimer, I don't want it to come across as if we have this all figured out, because surely we don't. And I hope that we can just be self-aware enough here as members of the church and, kind of leaders in this church space that we have, that we can maybe begin this conversation. But I think there's 2 major things that are at play here in the global church that I've kind of experienced. Is first, and like you mentioned it, the church tends to actively shy away from a lot of these topics that, like you said, we're going to get into in a moment. But also, I think there's an element of the church actively suppressing some of this stuff as well. And I think you can quantify those both into like this hyper-religiosity, like this whitewashed tomb syndrome. It's kind of like the Pharisee thing where it's like, oh, well, we're the church and we're leaders in the church, so we have to have it all together. And so on the outside, we're going to choose to A, not talk about this stuff, or B, when it does happen and we're aware of it, suppress it so that from the outside, it looks like everything is all good. And I think we've seen online that there's kind of this reckoning happening where everyone's like, hey, we're not into this. And we see it in the Church Too movement, that response to the Me Too movement. It's like, yeah, this stuff is happening in church too. And so let's start talking about it.
We're going to go in reverse chronological order. Okay. So the most popular issue will be read last. Let's start with number 5, coming in hot, pornography and masturbation. We know it's everywhere. We know every guy has dealt with it either currently or at some point in their life, and yet we almost never, ever talk about it. We were mentioning earlier, just sharing some stories that are not quite appropriate for this episode of Pro Church Tools. We were talking about the trope, the cliche of youth group where all the guys are at the altar and they're like, Lord, we're just confessing our sins. It's like, I got to the point where I was about 18 and I was like, we all know why we're here. Because I'm the type of person that just forces conversations on things. I forced my friends and I just go like, we're talking about masturbation. I don't care if you don't want to. We're talking about frequency. We're talking about problems because I can't be struggling alone, right? Yeah. And yet it was never an issue that we confronted head on in my youth group. It was something that was like, we know that's happening, but it's like, come on, just seek after the Lord. Like, help. I'm a teenager. Boy, I'm a teenage boy. Just give me help.
Yeah, there's these stigmas that surround a lot of these topics. And maybe if we were to have the courage to address some of this stuff head on in personal conversations, but also in a public conversation, maybe in church on a Sunday morning, it would help to end the stigma around a lot of these things. Specifically, you just hit on it, the stigma that it's only guys who struggle with this kind of stuff.
I just realized it as I said it. I was like, oh, I'm playing into the conversation right there.
But that's just been ingrained into us. And so it's time to like push back and be like, and just be honest with one another that, yeah, we're all kind of working through this stuff. So let's talk through it with one another so we can move through it in the most healthy way.
Issue number 4 was a catch-all. The word used frequently in the thread was abuse. I saw the word spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, abuse of power.
Of course.
And we're seeing this now as leaders of very prominent churches are, being exposed. We're talking about Willow Creek. We're talking about Mark Driscoll with the power abuse. We're talking about Pete Wilson at Crosspoint. And I have spoken one-on-one to these social media managers at these churches, to the pastors at these churches. So, this isn't just hearsay. This is like, oh no, I'm talking with the people that were there, and they just speak about this culture of, like, maybe things felt weird, but like you would never say anything because they're in charge. And now we have this generation that's growing up and being like, wait a minute, let's stop pretending that our leaders are perfect. Yeah. If you're listening or watching this and you look up to me at all, you should know I am the worst human being
it's not
and
quite
so
true.
many different things. Okay, I don't want to be like false humility, like false terribleness. Don't look up to me. I know some things about social, but just I'm not worth looking up to. And we have been growing up in this culture where we look up to our leaders and then they fall and then we don't discuss it either.
This is one of those ones that I think actively gets suppressed, actively gets swept under the rug. Historically, we've seen it happen in the Catholic Church.
The man of God. Don't come against the man of God.
And I don't mean to speak out about the Catholic Church like that, but historically, that's just what we've seen. We're still seeing it. But now, like you said, in the last few years, we've seen kind of the stuff come out amongst the classic evangelical churches, and it's just all been swept under the rug, often in the name of like just respecting authority, and it's time that we just reject that premise altogether.
Issue number 3, domestic violence. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the guest on the podcast was a survivor of domestic violence, and this individual, it was a woman, she talked about how she was in a relationship that was incredibly damaging. She feared for her life. She went to her church where her dad was the pastor, and she finally, after years, had to admit what was happening. Her pastor, father, and mother sided with her and said, we're going to help you get out of this. The church then excommunicated her, their pastor, and the wife of the pastor because divorce was considered worse than a man close to killing his wife.
Tragedy, man.
And this is a stain upon our history. One thing that I've begun doing, we did this last month, the month of February, I believe, which is still next month, but we've already completed the content for our social program. We put in 2 posts in that social program that basically just said, they were just like PSAs for churches saying, if you are struggling with domestic violence, like if you are not safe, if you are in danger, talk to us and we can help you. Because one of the things that this guest said on the podcast was, we don't ever even acknowledge this is happening in our churches, but this stat is something that has been, put out so many times, but nearly 1 in 4 women will experience severe physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime, which means it's happening in your church. Yeah. And yet we don't acknowledge that it's happening. And if a church isn't a safe place for people when that's happening, like, we've got to be better than the workplace. We've got to be better than the third place, the coffee shop. Like, if there's a place that you should be safe, it's the church. And so at least begin talking about it. The least we can do is, hey, put a post up on social media. Someone's going to see that from our social program in one of the hundreds of churches that use it, and someone will get out of a situation.
Yeah, give somebody courage.
Not because I'm a hero. Right. All we did was talk about it.
Yeah.
It's the simplest thing we can do.
Yeah, I think that story you just shared is perfect, like, anecdotal evidence of why I think a lot of women especially are hesitant to bring this stuff to their church, because historically the church just hasn't done a good job of responding to these kinds of situations. Like you said, they're like, they were excommunicated because, this verse in Matthew says you can't get divorced. And it's like, yeah, but I'm getting beaten to death. It's like, well, the Bible. So yeah. So I think we can do better. And like you just made the example, we can actually use social to take that first step into doing better.
It's like, doesn't require anything from us.
Yeah.
Bare necessities. Issue number 2, mental health and wellness. Yeah. I want to spend a bunch on issue number 1, and so I won't say too much here, but we know how important that mental health is. We know how much pastors are struggling with it. So if we can't talk about that with our congregation, how are we going to talk about it? If we can't be honest with ourselves, how are we going to be honest with our congregation? And so this is something we know that, Jesus talks about, helping us to live life and life to the fullest. We see the ministry of Christ and him healing the sick. And this extends not just to our physical bodies, but to our mental wellness as well.
Yeah.
And then issue number 1, politics. This was by far the most popular issue in the thread.
Yeah.
And this included, and I want to quote the words used in the thread here, this includes issues like abortion, the ill treatment of immigrants, the normalization of sexual abuse, there it is again, systemic racism, etc. The problem with church and politics, as I see it, is this. The church does not want to appear... What's the one where you're on one side? Is it partisan or
partisan?
Right. They
Partisan.
don't want to appear partisan.
Right.
And so our solution to that is we're going to pretend that we're not involved in politics at all.
Right.
If you're Republican, if you're Democrat, left or right, conservative, liberal, hey, we're here wherever you are on the spectrum. But that ignores the fact that we know the vast majority of white evangelicals vote in one direction.
Right.
What I loved about this individual's response was they included issues on both sides. They say abortion, which is typically a Republican thing, but they also mention the ill treatment of immigrants, the normalization of sexual abuse, systemic racism, which are normally more progressive side of the spectrum. The kingdom of Christ and the things that we stand for as Christians does not perfectly fit at all on either end of the spectrum. And the problem is when we do become partisan, and if we don't confront the fact that we are, as Christians, known to be on one side of the spectrum, you can't pretend that we're not. You just can't pretend that we're not. And younger people are like, can we just talk about this? And they're like, no, we can't appear political. It's like, well, you've already done that. So you need to work on fighting against it, because doing nothing is just conforming to what's already happening and saying this is fine.
I'd be interested to see some data from other countries, other demographics on how churches talk about politics there, because you and I are Canadian, we live in a border town, so we're very well acquainted with what goes on in the States. Most of our audience is American, and so we deal a lot with that kind of political climate. And you made mention of it, kind of this left and right, this two-party system. And so if you're not us, you're them. And I wonder, outside of a two-party system, if churches are more free and able to talk about politics. Because like you said, historically, the church has leaned to one side, so you can't really talk about what's on the other side. But if you can't talk about it in a church, you're leaving out so many of these important issues that people are reaching out and saying, hey, we need to be talking about this stuff, but under the name of like, it's politics, we can't chat about it in church. Well, then that stuff just goes unsaid. And I mean, if you look at the life and ministry of Jesus, he flipped the political structure of the world that he entered on its head. Saying that Jesus is Lord was one of the most outrageous political statements that has ever been made in the history of the world, because Caesar was Lord. It's printed on the money. And he said, yeah, just follow me and say that Jesus is Lord. That's an outrageously political statement. And so we have license to talk about politics in church, and we've shied away from it for so long. So many of these things we've shied away for talking about for so long. And so many people have been hurt in the wake of that. So many people have left church in the wake of that. So how about we wake up, get a little bit of courage, take a step of faith maybe in the direction of honesty, and start talking about this stuff in churches, so that we can live and learn and grow and heal together.
The 5 issues on this list: politics, mental health, domestic violence, abuse of all forms, pornography, masturbation. None of these are easy. You're going to screw it up when you talk about it. I screwed it up, and I prepped for this, and I still screwed it up. You're going to mess it up when you talk about this. But the other side of the coin is ignoring it, and younger people, which means now 40 and under, the vast majority of people on earth, they're just not going to tolerate that. We talk about authenticity, vulnerability, realness, and then we ignore every single thing people want to talk about. And this was something that our parents' generation did too. We don't talk about money. We don't talk about politics.
Right.
Well, guess what? Millennials don't care about that stuff. We want to talk about everything because we want our faith to inform the most real parts of life. You're going to screw it up. Do it in all forms of communication. Experiment on social if that's an easier place to start. We've done that with our social program. At the very least, one takeaway, one thing you could do right away. If you're not part of the social program, create a post that just acknowledges domestic violence and says, hey, if you are in danger, If you fear for anything, hey, get in touch with us and we will help.
Yes.
It's a great first step, requires very little from you, and it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
That'll do it for this episode of Pro Church Tools. We'll see you in the comments. We'll see you next time.
2019, more like 20 subscribe teen. Make sure you never miss another video. Subscribe.
I was gonna ask you to like this video, but after that, I can't endorse that.